September 2nd, 1666. Just after midnight, Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. He's the king's baker. Decent job, steady work. He's just checked the ovens one last time before bed. Damped down the fires like he always does. Done it 1,000 times. He goes to sleep. 3 hours later, he wakes up choking on smoke. The whole shop's ablaze. Flames everywhere. He grabs his daughter, yells for his manservant. They climb out an upstairs window and crawl across the neighboring rooftops. His maid's too terrified to follow. She stays behind. First victim of what's about to become the worst fire in London's history. Over the next 5 days, 4/5 of the city of London burns. 13,200 houses gone. 87 churches reduced to rubble. St. Paul's Cathedral, destroyed. Most of the official buildings, ash. 100,000 people lose their homes. That's nearly 80% of everyone living in the old city. The flames are so massive you can see them from 40 miles away. Molten lead from church roofs literally pours through the streets. And when it's finally over, when the smoke clears and people start counting bodies, they find something insane. 6 deaths. 6 people. In a fire that consumed an entire city. But here's the thing nobody talks about. That fire saved London. It killed the plague that had just murdered 100,000 people the year before. It forced the city to rebuild properly instead of staying a disease-ridden medieval death trap. And it created building codes and firefighting principles that would save millions of lives over the next few centuries. This is the story of how the worst disaster in London's history turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to it. To understand why this fire was both inevitable and necessary, you need to picture London in 1666, not the London of stone and brick you know today. Picture a city built almost entirely of wood. Medieval London was a timber city, houses with wooden frames, wooden floors, wooden walls, roofs covered with thatch or wooden shingles. Even London Bridge, the only bridge across the Thames, was lined with wooden buildings jutting out over the water on both sides. The city had grown organically over 1,000 years with zero planning. Streets were narrow, winding, irregular, some barely 6 feet wide. Houses leaned inward as they rose higher, upper stories jutting out over the streets until neighbors on opposite sides could nearly shake hands from their windows. Sunlight rarely reached street level in most neighborhoods. These timber houses weren't just close together, they were touching, shared walls, shared roofs, connected attics. Wealthy merchants built their houses directly against their neighbors. The poor subdivided existing buildings into smaller and smaller tenements. Every available inch was occupied. The population density was staggering. Within the old city walls, roughly 1 square mile, lived about 80,000 people. Outside the walls, in the growing suburbs, another 300,000. London had exploded in size, but it did so by cramming more people into the same medieval footprint. And everywhere was combustible material. Not just the wooden buildings, but the contents. Every household stored fuel for heating and cooking. Chandlers made candles from tallow and wax. Brewers and distillers operated with open flames. Blacksmiths, bakers, metalworkers, all used fire for their trades. There were regulations, sure. Fire buckets required by law outside every shop. Curfews on when you could use open flames. Fines for dangerous practices. But enforcement was a joke. This was a city with no fire brigade, no organized emergency response, no building inspections worth mentioning. The summer of 1666 had been brutal, hot and bone dry. No significant rain since the spring. Wooden buildings baked in the heat. Wells ran low. The Thames was lower than anyone could remember. London wasn't just waiting to burn, it was begging for it. But fire wasn't even London's biggest problem in 1666. The year before had been worse. Way worse. 1665. The Great Plague. It started in the spring. A few deaths in the slums of St. Giles in the Fields, outside the city walls. Poor neighborhood, crowded tenements. Authorities didn't pay much attention at first. Plague was always around in London, a few dozen deaths a year, normal background noise. By summer, it wasn't background noise anymore. The disease spread through the cramped wooden houses like wildfire. Entire families dead in days, bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. The death carts rolling through streets at night, drivers calling, "Bring out your dead." Red crosses painted on infected houses, families locked inside to die together. The wealthy fled. Anyone with money got out of London as fast as they could. The king and his court left for Oxford. Merchants abandoned their shops. Doctors, lawyers, clergymen, gone. The poor couldn't leave. They stayed and died. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, stayed in London through most of it. He wrote about walking through streets that used to be packed with people, now silent and empty, grass growing between the cobblestones because there was no foot traffic to wear it down, entire neighborhoods abandoned. The official death toll was 68,596, but that only counted deaths in the 130 parishes inside and immediately outside the city walls. The real number was probably closer to 100,000, maybe more, a quarter of London's population. Gone in 6 months. By winter, the plague burned itself out. Too many dead, too few left to infect. The survivors emerged into a traumatized city. Businesses destroyed, families shattered, the economy in ruins. And here's the thing about the plague. It thrived in exactly the conditions that defined London. Overcrowding, filth, poor sanitation, rats everywhere, no understanding of disease transmission, the medieval layout of the city, all those cramped wooden houses with shared walls and no ventilation, was perfect for spreading plague. Londoners knew this. They'd lived through multiple plague outbreaks. 1563, 1603, 1625, 1665. Every generation got hit. Everyone understood that the city itself was the problem. The way it was built, the way people lived packed together, the garbage in the streets, the open sewers, the contaminated water. But nobody knew how to fix it. You can't just tear down a city and start over, can you? Well, you can if someone burns it down for you. Back to Farriner's bakery, early morning, September 2nd. The fire starts around the 1 a.m. By 3 a.m., Farriner and his family have escaped across the rooftops. His mate is dead. The bakery is fully engulfed. The fire spreads to the Star Inn next door, then to the houses on either side, then down Pudding Lane toward the Thames. Within an hour, a dozen buildings are burning. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, gets woken up around 3 a.m. Someone's banging on his door, yelling about a fire on Pudding Lane. Bloodworth is not impressed. Fires happen all the time in London. He stumbles to the window, looks at the glow in the distance, and says something that will haunt him forever. Piss on it. A woman could piss it out. He goes back to bed. Bloodworth's reaction wasn't actually that unreasonable. London had fires constantly. Most of them got contained to a few buildings. The standard response was to create fire breaks by pulling down houses in the fire's path with hooks and ropes. It usually worked. But this wasn't a usual fire. And this wasn't a usual night. Remember, bone-dry summer, no rain in months, everything tinder dry. And there was wind, strong east wind blowing straight from Pudding Lane toward the heart of the city. The wind picked up embers and carried them hundreds of feet, starting new fires ahead of the main blaze. By dawn, half of Pudding Lane is gone. The fire has spread to Thames Street, where all the warehouses are, and Thames Street is packed with combustible materials. Timber yards, rope-making shops, stores of coal, tar, oil, tallow, spirits, everything you need to make a fire unstoppable. Around 7 a.m., the warehouses start to explode. Barrels of oil igniting with massive fireballs. Tar boiling and running through the streets in flaming rivers. The heat becomes so intense that buildings catch fire just from radiant heat, without flames ever touching them. Samuel Pepys wakes up to his maid telling him there's a fire across the city. He's not too worried at first. He goes back to sleep. Later that morning, he climbs the Tower of London to get a view. What he sees changes his mind instantly. An infinite great fire, he writes. The whole sky to the west is orange, smoke rising in massive columns. He can see buildings collapsing into the flames from miles away. Pepys does something smart. He goes straight to Whitehall Palace and tells the king. King Charles II, to his credit, takes it seriously. He sends orders to Lord Mayor Bloodworth. Create fire breaks immediately. Pull down houses in the fire's path. Do whatever it takes, but Bloodworth hesitates. Pulling down houses means destroying property. Who's going to compensate the owners? What if the fire doesn't actually reach those buildings, and he's destroyed them for nothing? He'll be liable. So he dithers. And while he dithers, the fire spreads. By afternoon, it's jumped from Thames Street into the dense residential neighborhoods. Cheapside, the main shopping street, is threatened. The Guildhall, The center of city government is at risk. St. Paul's Cathedral, the largest building in London, stands directly in the fire's path. People start to panic. The streets fill with refugees carrying whatever they can save. Carts piled with furniture, clothes, valuables. Rich merchants hiring every available wagon to move their goods. The roads out of the city jam with traffic. The river fills with boats. Anyone with a vessel is charging extortionate rates to ferry people and goods to safety. Pepys himself hires a boat to move his wine and important papers to a friend's house in Bethnal Green. By nightfall, September 2nd, a huge section of the city is burning. The flames are visible from 10 miles away. The heat is so intense that people can feel it from across the river in Southwark. And it's still spreading. Monday. The fire has been burning for 24 hours. King Charles makes a critical decision. He takes direct control. Bloodworth has proven useless, frozen by indecision. The king establishes firefighting posts around the perimeter of the fire, puts his brother, the Duke of York, in charge, and starts coordinating the response personally. The strategy: create fire breaks by demolishing buildings ahead of the flames. But not with hooks and ropes anymore. That's too slow. They're using gunpowder. Teams of soldiers move through neighborhoods, evacuating residents, then blowing up houses to create gaps the fire can't cross. It's brutal, and it doesn't always work. The wind keeps shifting, carrying embers over the fire breaks and starting new blazes. The fire is now moving in multiple directions. It's spread north from Thames Street into the heart of the commercial district. Cheapside is burning. The Royal Exchange, the center of London's financial world, catches fire around midday. Its lead roof melts and pours into the streets. St. Paul's Cathedral becomes the focal point. The medieval cathedral, one of the largest buildings in Europe, sits on a hill in the center of the city. People have been moving their valuables there for safety, thinking stone walls will protect them. Booksellers have stacked thousands of books in the crypt and nave. They're wrong. By late afternoon, the fire reaches St. Paul's. The wooden scaffolding around the building, there for ongoing repairs, catches first. Then the roof. St. Paul's has a massive wooden roof covered with lead. When the wood catches fire, the lead melts. Imagine this: hundreds of tons of molten lead pouring off the cathedral roof like a waterfall. It flows through the streets, still burning, setting fire to everything it touches. The heat is so intense that the stone itself starts to crack and explode. Flying fragments of burning stone shoot hundreds of feet. John Evelyn, another famous diarist, watches from across the city. "The stones of St. Paul's flew like grenades," he writes, the lead melting down the streets in a stream. By nightfall Monday, St. Paul's is a ruin. The roof is gone. The interior is gutted. Centuries of history gone in an afternoon. The fire is now completely out of control. It's burning in a front nearly a mile wide. The heat is creating its own weather, generating winds that feed the flames. Firestorms are forming, vortexes of flame that suck in air and combustible material like tornadoes. People flee in terror. The roads are clogged. Fights break out over wagons and boats. Prices for transportation skyrocket. Some people just give up, camp in the open fields outside the city walls, and watch their homes burn. There are also rumors. Paranoid, ugly rumors. England is at war with France and the Dutch. Someone starts saying the fire was set deliberately. Foreign saboteurs. Papist conspirators. Angry mobs attack anyone who looks or sounds foreign. Several innocent people are beaten or killed before authorities restore order. The king himself rides through the burning districts, trying to encourage the firefighting crews, handing out money from his own purse to keep them working. It's dangerous. Burning debris is falling everywhere. Buildings collapse without warning. But Charles stays visible, trying to prevent complete panic. By the end of Monday, September 3rd, roughly 300 acres of London are destroyed, and the fire is still spreading. Tuesday, the fire has been burning for over 48 hours. The wind finally shifts. It's been blowing steadily east to west, pushing the fire deeper into the city. But Tuesday morning, the wind drops, then shifts to the south. This is the break the firefighters need. The fire breaks they've been creating, the demolished buildings and cleared spaces, finally have a chance to work. Without the wind driving embers across the gaps, the fire starts to slow. But it's not over yet. The fire is still burning in multiple locations. Whole neighborhoods are still engulfed. The Duke of York and his teams keep working, demolishing buildings, organizing bucket chains, trying to contain the remaining blazes, One of the most dramatic moments happens at the Tower of London. The fire reaches the eastern edge of the city, threatening the tower itself. If the tower burns, the country loses its main armory, gunpowder stores, the royal mint, and the crown jewels. The garrison creates a massive firebreak by demolishing all the buildings immediately surrounding the tower. They use gunpowder liberally, not caring about collateral damage. It works. The fire reaches the cleared zone and has nothing left to burn. The tower survives. By Tuesday evening, the main fire is finally under control. There are still scattered fires burning, buildings collapsing, embers smoldering, but the uncontrollable inferno is contained. Wednesday, September 5th, the fire finally dies. 4 days after it started, isolated pockets still burn for days afterward. But the Great Fire of London is effectively over. The scale of the destruction is staggering. 87 churches destroyed, 13,200 houses burned, the Guildhall gutted, the Royal Exchange gone, St. Paul's Cathedral a ruin. Most of the official buildings of the city administration destroyed. Roughly 436 acres inside the city walls completely burned. Another 63 acres outside the walls. The area burned is about 1 square mile. Doesn't sound like much, right? But that square mile was the densest part of one of Europe's largest cities, the commercial heart of England, the financial center of a growing empire. 100,000 people are homeless. That's 4/5 of the city's population. Most of them are camping in the fields outside the walls, living in temporary shelters, trying to figure out what to do next. And here's the strange thing. The death toll is 6 people, 6 verified deaths, in a fire that burned for 4 days and destroyed 13,200 houses. How is that possible? Several reasons. First, the fire moved slowly enough that people could flee ahead of it. Unlike modern fires in steel and concrete buildings, which can kill people in minutes, the Great Fire took hours to consume neighborhoods. People had time to grab valuables and run. Second, most deaths in fires come from smoke inhalation in enclosed spaces. The Great Fire was entirely outdoors. People could see it coming, could breathe relatively fresh air, could escape. Third, the death toll might actually be higher. The official count only includes bodies that were identified and recorded. In the chaos of the fire, with buildings collapsing and entire streets consumed, there could have been people who died and were never found, burned beyond recognition or buried in rubble. But even accounting for missing victims, the death toll was remarkably low. Hundreds, maybe, not thousands. Not the tens of thousands you might expect. Still, the destruction was total. The London that existed on September 1st was gone. Medieval London, the city that had grown organically since Roman times, was erased in 4 days. Now here's where it gets interesting. Did the Great Fire actually end the plague? The conventional story says yes. The fire burned down all the cramped, filthy, rat-infested medieval housing where plague thrived. When London rebuilt with brick and stone, wider streets, better sanitation, the plague couldn't get a foothold anymore. It's a nice story, and it's partly true, but the reality is more complicated. The plague had already burned itself out by September 1666. The last major outbreak was in 1665. By the time of the fire, plague deaths had dropped to nearly 0. The fire didn't kill the plague directly because the plague was already gone. What the fire did do was prevent the plague from coming back. See, plague in London followed a pattern. It would hit every generation or so, kill thousands or tens of thousands, then recede for years before returning. The cycle had repeated for centuries. Everyone assumed it would happen again. But after the Great Fire, it didn't. London never had another major plague outbreak. Why? The rebuilding. When London was reconstructed after the fire, it was built differently. Brick instead of timber. Reducing fire risk, but also creating buildings that rats had harder time infesting. Streets were wider, improving ventilation and making it easier to clean. Building codes were enforced, preventing the worst overcrowding. More importantly, the fire forced infrastructure improvements. Better water supply, the beginning of a proper sewage system, garbage removal that actually worked. All the things that medieval London had lacked. None of this was done specifically to fight plague. Nobody in 1666 understood germ theory or disease transmission. They didn't know that rats and fleas spread plague. They just knew that crowded, filthy conditions made people sick. So they rebuilt cleaner, wider, more organized, and it worked. The plague never returned to London, not because the fire killed it directly, but because the fire forced the city to rebuild in ways that made plague transmission much harder. In that sense, the fire absolutely saved lives. Not immediately, but over the following decades and centuries. How many Londoners didn't die of plague in the 1680s, 1700s, 1720s because their city had been rebuilt properly? Thousands. Tens of thousands, maybe more. The immediate question after the fire: what now? Some people wanted to abandon London entirely, move the capital somewhere else, somewhere safer. Others wanted to rebuild exactly as it was, same streets, same layout. Property owners wanted to reclaim their exact plots. King Charles had different ideas. He commissioned Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect and mathematician, to design a completely new London. Wide boulevards radiating from central plazas, grand public squares, organized districts, a planned city, modern and rational, like nothing England had ever seen. Wren's plan was gorgeous. It was also completely impractical. The problem was property rights. Every plot of burned land had an owner. Rich merchants, guilds, churches, the crown. All of them had legal title to specific pieces of ground. Wren's plan would have required forcibly redistributing all that property. Never going to happen. Instead, London rebuilt on the old street pattern, more or less. Same basic layout, same property divisions, but with crucial changes mandated by law. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 established new building codes. All new buildings had to be brick or stone, no more timber construction in the city center. Buildings had to follow height limits and setback requirements. Streets had to be widened to minimum standards, no overhanging upper floors. It wasn't the revolutionary transformation Wren wanted, but it was still a massive improvement. The new London was safer, cleaner, more organized, and it was accomplished in a remarkably short time. Within a decade, most of the city was rebuilt. Christopher Wren didn't get to redesign the whole city, but he got something almost as good. He was commissioned to rebuild 51 of the 87 destroyed churches. His designs transformed London's skyline. And then there was St. Paul's. The old medieval cathedral was beyond repair. Wren designed a completely new cathedral, the masterpiece that still dominates London today. It took 35 years to build, but when it was finished in 1711, it was one of the greatest buildings in Europe. The rebuilt London became a model. Other cities watched and learned. When fire or war destroyed cities, they rebuilt with London's lessons in mind. Brick construction, wider streets, building codes, enforced standards. The modern city, as a concept, was born from London's ashes. So what did the Great Fire actually accomplish? First, it ended medieval London, the city that had existed since Roman times, that had grown organically through the Middle Ages, was gone. In its place rose a modern city, planned and regulated. Second, it established the principle of building codes. Before the fire, London had regulations, but no real enforcement. After the fire, building standards became law, backed by penalties and inspections. This model spread across the world. Third, it created the first professional fire insurance industry. After the fire, several companies started offering fire insurance. They formed their own fire brigades to protect insured buildings. Eventually, these private brigades evolved into modern professional fire departments. Fourth, it demonstrated that cities could be rebuilt quickly and well after catastrophic destruction. London went from smoking ruins to thriving metropolis in about a decade. This gave other cities confidence that they could survive and recover from disasters. Fifth, and maybe most importantly, it saved lives, not the 6 people who died in the fire, the millions who didn't die of plague over the following centuries because London's infrastructure improved. Think about it. If London had never burned, it probably would have kept the same medieval layout. Cramped timber houses, narrow streets, primitive sanitation. The plague would have returned, again and again, as it did in cities across Europe that didn't have their own great fires. London's death rate from infectious disease dropped dramatically after the rebuilding. Infant mortality fell, life expectancy rose. The city grew rapidly and safely in ways that medieval London never could have. All because a baker in Pudding Lane forgot to properly damp his oven one night in September 1666. The Great Fire of London killed 6 people and saved 1 million, maybe more. It's one of history's great paradoxes, a catastrophic disaster that was also an incredible stroke of luck. The medieval city had to die so the modern city could be born. London today, the city of 8 million people, the global financial center, couldn't exist if the Great Fire hadn't happened. The old medieval layout couldn't support that kind of population. The infrastructure couldn't handle it. The disease burden would have been unsustainable. The fire forced London to modernize a century earlier than it otherwise would have. It compressed decades of gradual improvement into a few years of intensive rebuilding. And the lessons learned, the building codes established, the infrastructure created, saved countless lives over the centuries that followed. Thomas Farriner's bakery is long gone. Pudding Lane still exists, a narrow street in the financial district with a monument marking where the fire started. The monument itself, a massive column designed by Christopher Wren, stands 202 feet tall. The height equals its distance from the spot where the fire began. St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's masterpiece, rises above the city, a reminder that from destruction can come beauty. From catastrophe can come progress. The Great Fire burned for 4 days in September 1666, but it shaped London for the next 350 years. And in a strange way, that fire is still burning. Every modern city that enforces building codes, that plans for fire safety, that builds with stone instead of wood in dense urban areas, is learning from London's disaster. 6 people died, a city was destroyed, and millions of lives were saved. That's the legacy of the Great Fire of London.